All right, it's Ed here from Geek, and I am here with Scott Channell, author of 3 excellent sales books, all around the topic of setting outbound sales appointments. Scott's a master cold caller. 3 of his books are Setting Sales Appointments. His next book is 7 Steps to Sales Scripts for B2B Appointment Setting, and his most recent book, which is on my best-selling list, is the Sell the Meeting book, which is an excellent book takes you through A to Z on how to set outbound B2B appointments. Scott, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. I've got a face for radio. I'm blushing at your compliments, so thank you very much.
Absolutely, man. So give me an idea on the current state of appointment setting in the B2B cold calling world.
Yeah, so, actually, if you don't mind, you've been very complimentary about my books, and, you're in a very competitive industry.
Sure.
You said the books helped you
Yep.
to get off the ground and to really stand out. So I'm kind of curious as to how the books helped you in your business.
Sure. So the first book we read was Setting Sales Appointments, and that's the oldest of the books. The next one we read was the 7 Steps to Sales Scripts, and that basically helped us fine-tune a bit. And then we were off and running. We built out lists that we wanted to target, and we built out cadences, and we use cold calling to this day. I think there's nothing better for forcefully building your business than outbound. Inbound is excellent. The deals close faster. They're easier sales. But inbound takes time, and you've got to build your brand and market. You've got to build your inbound channels for that to actually happen. So, if you're sitting back and you need that needle to start moving, you got to pick up the phone, or you got to start cold emailing, start doing direct mail, getting out into the market. So for us, cold calling has been a game changer. We've had a full-time salesperson cold calling for us now for a long time, and that person consistently sets 2 to, I think his max he set in one day was 13 appointments. So
wow.
Yeah, he's a beast. He likes challenges. So it's been really effective for us. On those 13, I will say not all 13 showed. Maybe 10 showed, and 8 were super qualified, and we closed some deals out of it. But yeah, I'm a fan, man. I'm a fanboy. I always talk about your books. I'm always pushing them on people. I send them as gifts to some clients. Yeah, it's been a life-changing book for us.
Well, you mentioned some things that I think are important to focus on. Is interesting to me is, the book that I wrote in '04, which is really much more basic than the more recent stuff, is
right.
The one you keep mentioning is helping you the most. And I think that's important to mention because, it is really the basics. One of the things I say is that if you do the basics right, that's typically enough for you to beat 90% of the competition out there, and I really, really, really do believe that.
Right.
And that first book lays out the basics, in a very dated way, but it does lay out the basics. And then you mentioned the importance of the list, and so critical. I know we're going to talk about that, and so many get that wrong and defeat themselves even before they make the first call, and you mentioned that right off the bat. Having a system, you mentioned the cadence, and you have to have a system and stick to it. And then, I like the way you said, hey, forcefully build your business. So it's, you're going directly at your highest probability, your highest value buyers. And even though your system is very powerful, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're jerks or we're browbeating anybody. It just means that, by forceful, I've always thought of, the analogy of communicating scripts and having kind of a 2x4 in your hand. You speak softly, but you carry a powerful stick because your words have impact.
Right.
And so I thought it's interesting that you mentioned forcefully, so we can be very aggressive and forcefully work through a group of highly probable targets, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're off-putting or we're not professional or anything like that, but we're going directly at them, and we're doing everything we can to get their attention and enable them to see that it's worthwhile to meet. So,
right. Yep. I 100% agree. And if you look at the Fortune 500, if you look at all the tech businesses, even ones that rely heavily on inbound, they all have outbound sales teams. And that should tell you something. Like I always use HubSpot as the example. HubSpot's like the golden child of the inbound marketing world. And they've got an outbound sales team that sets outbound sales appointments for their business. And that shows that when you have growth targets you've got to hit, inbound isn't the only way you should be looking to grow the business. You've got to have some what's the word? Not momentum. What's the word? You got to get out of your chair and start making calls. You got to put your foot forward and instead of being reactive, waiting for the leads to come in, you've got to be proactive and really dip your toe in that market and start picking up the phone and dialing.
Yeah, and I also think too that what you just said about online companies that preach going online, but they also have an outbound effort. Is that so important? Because one of the points I wanted to make here is that the techniques are not mutually exclusive. Okay, so and you, in fact, now I, for whatever reason, seem to be good at appointment setting. I set 2,000 appointments among CEOs, C-level, before I started teaching sales teams. But I always say to people, look, I'm not saying that appointment setting is better than the other technique. In fact, if you have techniques, marketing techniques, that deliver what you need faster and more effectively, I would encourage you to use them. So you should be marketing tool agnostic, so to speak. And if appointment setting and going directly at people makes economic sense for you, then use it. And if you do use it, my God, do it right, okay? Don't, try it and have lousy scripts and call the wrong people and then say this thing doesn't work. Whatever marketing tool you use, B2B appointment setting included, if you're going to use it, do it right. Do it right. So be marketing agnostic. The other thing is, too, I've always thought of appointment setting, this might be curious coming from an appointment setter, is really not about appointment setting. I've always thought of appointment setting is more about part of a business growth system. And it speaks to the importance, and I think at a lot of people who get into appointment setting, they immediately start thinking about scripts and how many times to call and all the kind of the details of getting the results. But they forget, I think sometimes, or don't pay enough attention to the overall environment in which appointment setting sits. So if a company's working the right strategy, meaning they got the big picture, they know the target market, the services they're offering, they know who's most likely to buy, and calling fits into that overall effective picture, it works. But if you're going to try calling and you don't have your strategy right, you haven't really figured out properly which are the right tools to use or how to use them or allocate your assets, then you can call to doomsday. Okay, you are not going to get there. So you got to have that bigger system in mind and have it right before you can select any tool. And in appointment setting is just one of those tools that you can select. Right.
Well, okay, that's an interesting point. So the digital marketing space where I play is a notoriously high margin business. When you look at a business that wants to start doing cold calling, what are some numbers, what are some metrics you look at to make sure that it's going to be it's going to make sense for them to actually do it? When you look at return on time, return on investment.
Great question. And one thing I want to mention is, when I started calling, it was before the internet hit. All right. So when cold calling truly was cold calling. All right. I mean, I remember the days when you say to people, "Hey, I can send you an email," and they go, "Oh, you're kidding me! You can do that." So that's the environment in which I learned. And I guess my point is that the window in which calling is economically viable certainly has closed over the years or the decades since I have been doing this. And today, the companies where it's more economically viable is, first of all, you mentioned a higher margin profit service. So right away, that is one of the things you look at. And you look for recurring revenue. So in your business, people sign on, I'm assuming, for a monthly service or annually or so forth. So if you've got high margins and you have a subscription, multiple purchase business, that makes it possible for you to do appointment setting. I throw like commercial cleaning, for an example, that people might relate to, fits into that. People need it. They're looking for changes. When they sign on, they're going to stick with you for 6 months, 15 months or more.
Right.
That works out. The other thing is very high-ticket items where, another sort of hot market is all sorts of different types of consulting businesses where, you market, there might be very high-ticket items, so it's cost-effective to go directly at those executives in the companies that might write those, multi-million-dollar checks. Or if you have a profitable market and there's only a small pool. I mean, I work with some companies where, hey, they may only have 300 or 400 buyers in the world that are real. So in all of those circumstances, either high margin, repetitive purchases, high ticket items, or where there's a very small concentrated pool, and let's add to this, where traditional marketing or online marketing doesn't get to them quick enough. So again, I'm not saying that it's better than anything else, but sometimes you just don't want to wait, or to use your term, you want to go right at them, and those are the people that can use appointment setting successfully today. So the broad range, those are the things that I look for.
Got it. Okay. And I guess we'll dive right into the list then at that point. When you're looking at building a list to call upon, can you go over some of the important factors you're looking for? Are you looking for a particular niche? Are you looking for a particular revenue in the client mix? Give me an idea of how you would go about building a list.
Yeah. So let me start by answering that question by telling people what not to do, okay? Because lots of times I get called in, obviously, on failing programs, help, call centers or companies where things just aren't working.
Well, that's why we bought your book. So, it worked. Your system did work, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. So when I go into those situations, by far the biggest reason why people don't get an appointment setting program off the ground, or if they're trying very hard but it's not working, by far, there's not a second, third, or fourth option here. By far the biggest mistake they make is they call the wrong list. They cast their nets way too wide, and they're not focused on their higher probability targets. And I'll give you an example. So in my calling days, when I used to call, clients would say, "No, you don't have to worry about the list. We got that." I would never, ever, ever do a project if I did not have control of the list, because I knew that virtually all of the time the clients are going to cast the net way too wide, and then expect me to, work through their manure pile, hoping to find a few nuggets. What I was always trying to do is pick that higher probability vein of gold, and I wanted to jackhammer right through it, and increase the probabilities of success by having more fish in the pond, so to speak. So first of all, I got to say that people, whenever, there's certain phrases I hear and I go, oh my God, poor bastards, is, when people say they don't want to miss anybody, that's, oh God, you do want to miss people, okay? You want to miss the people who are lower probability or lower value. But people have this thing in their head, well, we've had some clients that are smaller, or we've had some clients that don't fit into the core. We don't want to miss out on them. That's the wrong way to think. The only thing you want to be thinking about is, I get X amount of money. I got X amount of time. I want to put that in the places where it's going to get me the highest return, period. All right? So missing out on someone isn't part of the equation. It's how can I leverage limited time and limited money to bring the most revenue profit margin into my company. So back to your mistake after that rant is, what do you look for? So basic marketing 101. future people who buy tend to look like people who have already bought. So the first thing I would say to people is you pull out a list of companies that have actually purchased from you, 2 years worth, don't go more than 3 years worth. Pull up the list and create a model of them. So for a lot of clients, I like to use the Sales Genie tool. So I'll get a list of clients, I'll look up each one, and I'll make note in an Excel spreadsheet as to their SIC codes, both primary and secondary, their revenue range, and then after I look them up, I look for clumps, and I say, gee, most of the people who bought tend to be in these industry ranges. They tend to be of this certain size. So guess what? Common sense tells us that the most likely buyers are going to look like the people who've already bought. So if you had the choice to call a group of people who were 100% within that highest probability profile, or you had the choice to call a group where maybe only 10% of people in that group were of your highest probability profile, everyone else was lower, where are you going to have the most success? So you always start with profiling very tightly your targets, mostly by those who have purchased in the past. If you are newer, then you might build your profile based upon those that you know are already purchasing from competitors, but they have to be actual purchasers. They can't be people that you think or hope or wish might buy. They have to be based upon buyers. And another point here, Ed, and this is pretty consistent. When companies do the total universe, I always would encourage them to divide it into segments. So there's, say your C, if you go A, B, C, D, and E scale, your C prospects are your average prospects. They're solid bread and butter type targets. And then your B targets are better than average, however you define average for your industry, but they're not the top tier. And then your A is your top tier. And in virtually all instances, as a rule of thumb, your A target group among the whole pool is going to be anywhere from maybe 5, no more than 8% of that universe. So if you're trying to get a calling program off the ground, where are you going to allocate your time and money? Among that group that typically is going to keep you busy 100% in the A calling for 6 months, or are you going to call the rest? How much time are you going to spend on B, C, D, or worse, E-type records because you don't do that little bit of work? So to answer your question, on the list, profile based upon past behavior, get it tight, and laser focus solely on those that look like those who have previously bought.
Got it. Okay. And so right now we're talking about drivers of success. We just went through the first one, which is selecting the right list. So swim in the right pool. Next one is script. Give me an idea of the importance of having a script and what that script might look like, without going into too much detail, because your books have dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of different scripts to use. So without going into too much detail about what the script is, give me an idea of why a script.
Yeah. So I think it's really important when people think about verbiage that's going to achieve their business purpose, which is to book a meeting, that they kind of understand what's going on here, okay? A lot of times, Ed, callers focus on what's comfortable for them. So I'll hear, I don't want to be salesy, whatever that means. I don't want to push anybody. But the bottom line is you need to not focus on what you're comfortable with. You really have to focus on 100% what's going to be meaningful to buyers. So even among a great group, and this is, I think, really important for people to appreciate. So say you do your profile, Ed, and you define your A targets. Well, statistically, we know that even among a very high-quality A group, that only 15 or 20% of that group would be viable, meaning that they recognize a need and they would go to another vendor or change vendors if given sufficient reason to do so. So it means that even when you're doing all the right things in terms of working your group, that only 15 or 20% of people have a need and would be willing to change. So when it comes to scripting, a lot of people think that everybody they call is the same, and they're not. Meaning there's buyers, there's people who recognize needs, and if you said the right things, would go to the next step with you. And then there's non-buyers, people who are satisfied, have no reason to change, or don't purchase it. So when you craft your scripting, you have to be 100% focused on buyers. So when you call someone and someone picks up the phone, you don't know if they're dissatisfied with their current vendor, if they're looking for options, if they don't think they're getting what they're paying for or not. And you need to speak to them. You have seconds, moments in which to activate something where they go, oh, I'm going to listen to this a little bit more. Oh, they may help me, all right? So, instead of opening up a script by groveling because it makes you feel better. Oh, I know you're busy. Let me take a minute. That type of stuff. You don't say anything to buyers, which gives them a reason to mention to you. I've always gone by value. Hey, always nice, always professional, but your script is, hey, when someone says hello, I don't know if they have a need. I don't know if they're open to going to the next step, but I have to assume that they do. Say the things that buyers need to hear to listen longer, go to the next step with you. Care not what the non-buyers might think. It's always puzzled me why people would call and then they seem to put more importance on having comfortable conversations with people that are never going to buy anyway and are going to forget you once you hang up the phone 2 seconds later, than picking up the phone and very clearly in the script, clearly saying, hey, this is what I do, this is why I'm credible, here's the benefits I deliver, and this is what I want. And do that in 30 seconds so that a buyer, before they can even be thinking about, oh, here's another time waster because you're groveling and making excuses for calling, is they go, oh, this person might help me. Whoa, this person seems top shelf. Maybe if I do a Google search, I'm not going to be able to find someone as good as this. I'm going to listen. And then at the end of the 30 seconds, you have a foundation where people can either talk to you more or they can recognize that you might help them, or on the flip side, recognize that you can't. And they'll either interrupt you and say, this isn't for me, and the call, or at the end, tell you that they don't have a need. So I've often felt on the script that, laser focus on buyers, care only what they say. When someone picks up the phone, nicely and professional, be very direct. Do not add words that do not help your business purpose. Like, oh, I know you're busy, I'll only take a minute, or other such ridiculousness. Lay the value on the table and let people say yes or no. And I've always thought that it's curious to me that I'll hear a lot of people say, oh, you should get to the point and, you got to be respectful of people's time. And yet then they call and they get on the phone and they spend so much time saying nothing, okay, that helps buyers decide whether it's worthwhile to discuss. So think only of value. Think of, hey, if I'm talking to a buyer, what do they need? And I personally feel you're most respectful of people when you clearly and succinctly cover those bases. What I do, why I'm credible, benefits I deliver, what I want from you, and then just let people say yes or no. I think that's most respectful of people's time, and I think and it also is calculated to get you the most meetings because you start with a foundation of value and clarity.
Right. Okay. And in terms of cadence, let's say I had a list of like 5,000 companies. How often should I be calling them? And do you break it all into like groups of 100 or groups of 1,000? What would I do with a group of, like, say, 5,000 companies? How would I go about attacking that?
Yeah. So think of it as a funnel system. So rather than think, I'm going to call 100, I'm going to finish them, I'm going to call another 100, but think of it as a funnel where you're dumping fresh meat, I used to call it, new records into a funnel, and then you, through a process of calling, you identify the decision maker. In my books, I talk about what I call the 3 cycles of 3, which essentially is once you've identified the decision maker, that you're going to place 3 series of calls 3 business days apart. So the first thing you're going to do is, once you have the decision maker's name, is you're going to make 3 calls within a very short period of time. You know, in the old days, those 3 calls would be made on the same day, okay, morning, afternoon, and end of day, to try to get a hold of someone. Now you're going to make those calls over a day or 2, not over 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, but you're going to make 3 calls in a very quick succession. If you don't get a hold of them, you do not try to leave a message or anything. It's not until the 3rd dial of that sequence that, if you do not speak to your decision maker, that you would then leave your voicemail, send an email, and then 3 business days later start the cycle again. 3 calls in a very short period of time. The goal is to interact with the decision maker. If you cannot interact with the decision maker on the first 2 calls, you're not leaving messages or anything. On the 3rd dial, if you don't speak to them, you leave the voicemail, you send the email. 3 business days later, you do it one more time. So what happens is, over a period of roughly 2 weeks, somebody that's in your A pool that you consider to be a high probability buyer and that you have identified as a top decision maker within that company is going to, you've made at least 9 dials. And statistically, Ed, and this number is going up, you know, it takes a minimum of 9 to 12 dials before to call a certain person to get them to pick up the phone. So you're sort of on the lower end initially of how many dials it takes to have a reasonable expectation that someone will pick up the phone. And if you don't, you've left touches. You've left a voicemail and you've left email. So then at the end of the sequence, you have a decision to make. Now, if you think that somebody is, for whatever reason, a higher value target, then you can add a 4th sequence or a 5th sequence to the target before you let them go. But this is really, really, really important. As much as it is important to know who to call and how often to call and have the right messaging, I'm telling you, it's even more important to know when to stop calling and have a sense of the point of diminishing return. So if you think of your funnel system, you're dumping leads in one end of the funnel, Ed. You're working them in accordance with a plan. And then when you reach the point of diminishing returns, you let them go for a period of time. And my default was always 6 months. So you dump them in the funnel. You work the 3 cycles of 3 for roughly 2 weeks. Then you say, okay, I've made enough dials. They haven't picked up. They haven't responded. I've reached the point of diminishing returns. I will start my cycle again with them 6 months down the road. So what you're constantly doing is dumping new records, new high probability records into the funnel, working them, and then pushing them out. And there's obviously layers to that because you might make more attempts. There's things that you do in those first 2 calls that would add to your results. So on a simplified answer, you dump them in, you work the 3 cycles of 3, and then you push them off. Those that are worth the time, you would try again in 6 months. Dump them in, work them, point of diminishing returns, get rid of them. If they're worthwhile, call them again in 6 months. Am I answering your question there?
Yep, that was awesome. Okay. What are some, other than the core 3 or the big 3, the list, script, and cadence, what are some other drivers of success for a program?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think it's important for people to understand that in calling, it's all about probabilities, not possibilities. One of my kind of pet peeves is that a lot of people seem to be focused on the lunatic fringe or the exceptions to the rule more so than what happens most of the time, okay? And I think it's really important to understand that this is a game of probabilities, not possibilities. I mean, calling is brutal. Let's face it. It's not fun, okay? Even when it's working, it's not fun. And, I teach the stuff, but, the only thing that keeps me going is I know, hey, if I've got the right list, I've got the right system, good stuff plops out at the other end if I stick to it. But it's not because it's a great thing to do. So you've got to always stay focused on probabilities and not possibilities. I think a lot of people get diverted to shiny knobs or exceptions to the rules or things that might be nice. I think you really need to know the zone where, overall you're going to get the best results and have the discipline to stay within those zones. So always work the probabilities. And if you're going to go outside your probability zone, do so strategically and with a purpose, not because you want to see what happens. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, too, it gets not as much credit, is understand that people will focus on scripts or, calling sequences that are important. But I would really encourage people that to be successful, if you go back to the thought that, hey, even on a good pool of targets, only 15 or 20% of them are going to be in buy mode on some level, either immediately or, say, within the next year or so. So you have to work a large enough pool so that you can bump in. You got to be thinking, hey, I got to work a large enough pool efficiently enough so that I increase the odds that I bump into more of the only 15 or 20% that are in buy mode, and then work out my ratios so that, hey, if I have X number of conversations, I'm going to get a meeting. Of those meetings, a certain percentage are going to turn into a client, and then given margins, lifetime value, and so forth, that all makes economic sense. So I would say probabilities and bumping into people and really allocating the assets properly, which is really time and money, okay,
right,
to the spots where you can most leverage them for results. A lot of people get into like activity mode. I'm just going to start calling and see what happens. Nope. You really need to have the bigger picture figured out and know the higher probability spots and have a system plan that you're going to work and keep it going. And I would add that to your list. And obviously there's a lot more in the books, but that's what I would mention here.
One other thing I would throw on there, because you mentioned leverage and making the most of your time, is you have in book one, you have the idea of, okay, if plan A doesn't work, go to plan B, and building a list of people that are potentially interested. We already know they're in the right pool. Just because they're not buying, they didn't fall in that 5 or 10 or 20% that's actively looking today, doesn't mean they're not going to buy over the course of the year or the next 18 months or 2 years. So your plan B stuff in the book is excellent. Do you mind talking a little bit about what plan B is and how that works?
I'm glad that you brought that up, because a big part of success is, when you talk to someone and you have your plan and they, in essence, they say no, no, and no, go back to that statistic. Only 15 or 20% of them in active buy mode. So when you call them, you're hitting them only in a snapshot of time. So one of the things I talk about in the book, and for lack of a better phrase, Ed, I always called it the magic question, which is stupid, okay? But you call and they say no, 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 and then you end up and say, hey, look it. This is the way I did. I said, hey, look it, not a problem. Don't want to be on your back. Hey, but obviously we do an awful lot of this. Could you suggest a time we should be back in touch? And then you do the hardest thing for a salesperson to do, shut up. And you'd be surprised how many people will go, well, actually, call me in a month. Call me in 6 months. And then you say, oh, okay, great. Any particular reason why that's a good time to call? Yeah, we're slammed with month end, or we've got a new VP, whatever. You go, super, I'll do that. You don't try to go any deeper. So the point being is, if calling is economically viable, you know that you're offering something that people don't buy a lot. They buy infrequently. They change vendors frequently. And so when you interact with them, you want to give a buyer every opportunity you can to, I call it raise your hand out of the crowd. So after you've done all your core scripting stuff, you got your core script, you got your objections, they still say no. You want to squeeze that a little bit more, and you end up with the magic question. Hey, not a problem. Don't want to be on your back, but hey, we do an awful lot of this. Could you suggest a time I should be back in touch? I'm telling you, I don't know what your experience has been, but a lot of people will tell you when to call them back,
yep.
And 50% of those actually will book a meeting with you in the future, and then whatever your closing ratio is and your average size of sale, do the math. So a dead-end call, and I'm glad you brought that up. So, a dead-end call with that simple question at the end, all of a sudden, all that value. And that presupposes that you're calling the right pool, that, in your pitch you are laying out your credibility and value so that they're more likely to say, yeah, actually, call me in a month, call me in 3 months, call me in 6 months, and here's the reason why.
Got it. And what are your thoughts on downselling a piece of content of some sort? Not actually selling it, but getting them to, give up email address so that you can email over a piece of content that you can stay in contact with them over a period of time.
Well, if it's overall, I would say I'm not a fan. Okay, so I think at the end, if you can, and first of all, as a practical matter today, if you have the right tools pretty inexpensively, and a high percentage of the time you can get their email address and so forth. So I would say in certain circumstances it would, but if I was thinking about, the core strategy, I'm thinking about hitting the group on the phone. When I get them on the phone, a priority is not to get the email address. I listen to a lot of calls, Ed, where people seem to think that the priority is to get the email address instead of book the meeting. Right. No. So I spend 100% of the time on getting the meeting, getting an okay. You might, if you really had something to send them that was not generic corporate crap, okay, but generally helpful, make an offer to send that at the very end of the call where they have said, yes, I think it might be viable for us to meet in the future. But I think to offer that up front or in the middle or make that an objective of the call is wrongly placed. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking of email communication, you sent out an email maybe a week or two ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, about refocusing outreach during an economic downturn, specifically the story of an IT company who was able to actually grow through a recession. Do you mind taking a couple of minutes just to tell me that story and give me a little context there?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years after the last recession, I was at an IT company that had 25 outside salespeople. I spent a couple of days on site. And the CEO was a farmer. I don't know how he came to have an IT company, all right? But he was a farmer in a previous life. And he said he went through a couple of bad years and decided to find this company. But anyway, when in the last downturn, when things were so bad, IT and technology was one of the industries that got slaughtered, okay? And he said to me over dinner, he says, yeah, during the last downturn, rather than focus on increasing sales, because I knew we were going to lose sales, I figured that as long as I generated the same amount of margin or enough margin dollars, that I could pay my bills and survive. And in fact, that's what he ended up doing by focusing on generating he had the right goal. If I generate the margin dollars, I can pay my bills and emerge from this strong and then able to compete better. And that's exactly what he did. And I never forgot that story because it really pointed to me where a lot of people think it's all about more sales. You get more sales, you're going to make more money and be more successful. That's not necessarily true if in the inner workings of the company you're not generating enough margin if you don't have a healthy company. So this CEO was working a strategy. We talked about strategy up front, that appointment setting has to fit within a bigger picture strategy of a company being successful. And that is an example of an IT CEO having the right goal, focus on margin. And then when I work with them, they ended up booking, this is the absolute truth, more than 3,000 appointments across multiple states for IT services as a result of my 1-year engagement. Wow. And they ended up selling the company for a lot of money because they had good management and they had a good lead system too.
Got it. Okay. Your story reminds me of a story in your first book about a graphic designer or web designer, I can't remember specifically.
Right.
Yep. About
tell that story.
Yeah, so you got her to start fishing in the right pond and going after big clients, and you taught her outbound and turned her business around and made it way more profitable. So you don't necessarily need to scale to the moon, but you can change how much you're making per hour drastically just by targeting the right kinds of clients, on purpose.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that story, because that's also an example on a much smaller business that used outbound. So here was a person who was doing a graphic designer among companies, and great service, great person, did great work, but you know what? All the wrong people, making no money, working her butt off. And then when she did my graphics, I said, hey, wait a minute, I think I can help you. So when I looked at the clients and did the profile, out of her hundreds of clients, there were only 3 that were really great clients that treated her well and she made money on. And they were all companies that had more than $2.5 million of revenue. So we decided the sweet spot was, hey, we're going to focus on companies, I think it was either between 2.5 and 10 or 2.5 and 20 million, I forget, in certain industries within a certain radius of her home. And then I taught her husband to make the calls, and she called, got appointments. And there's another point to that story, that when we started booking meetings, or her husband started booking the meetings, she had no sales skills whatsoever, great graphic designer. And we went on, and I went with her on the meetings because I was teaching her sales. We went on 30 meetings before she closed a sale. And she kept going. In every meeting, we'd debrief, hey, you opened this way. When they said this, you want to say this. When this happens, you want to do that. And then after we got 30 meetings, she kept going. How many people would keep going and working after having booked 30 meetings and not selling one thing? And then, you know what, like the next 10 meetings, she ended up selling like 5 huge accounts and really learned it. So I guess the point of that is that you do have to dig in, okay, and learn. And another point of that story is I see a lot of people who give up, Ed, on things that would work if they just stuck with it. So I think it's really important for you to have reasonable expectations and strategically know how appointment setting fits into your plans. And because, appointment setting is a low response, high payback thing. So if you don't have reasonable expectations, you can be doing the right things, or if you dug in a little bit more, you could figure it out to something that would be really good for you. And a lot of people will they're doing the right things, but they abandon it too quick because maybe they don't have the right perspective or really know that they're doing the right things. And if they just dig in, perfect, keep going, have improvements in certain areas, that they're very close to something that could work out very well for them.
Yep, I definitely agree with that. And if the owner isn't or the salesperson isn't the one making the calls themselves, and you've hired someone new, I definitely recommend recording calls so you can actually train on those calls to make sure they're actually following the script and doing what it is that you've set up, and actually implementing the system and not winging it and getting discouraged and doing their own thing. So not all
good advice.
Equal. Yeah.
Really good advice. And I'll just add to that, what you're saying is the companies that I work with who are very successful at it, they don't let reps, first of all, you're dealing with people, most of the time you're dealing with, there are nuances. We're not trying to make people robots, but the bottom line is, you make an investment, you work a system well, and a certain amount spits out. And the companies that are really superior, there is a method to their madness, and they do expect reps within certain parameters to work their system. They don't allow reps to bet with their money, okay? So if you want to come into our company, here's our expectations, here's our roadmap as to how we prospect, how we conduct first meetings, how we deliver proposals. Within certain parameters, you have to stay close to our system. They do not, as to the point you're saying, they inspect things. For the reps' benefit, they do not let them get off course because they know what works.
Right, I like that. What was the phrase you said? They don't bet with their money. Is that what you said? I like that.
Yeah, Yeah, so you think of, in essence, what we're doing here, my point about, hey, we're working probabilities, we're placing bets, based upon what we know about list responsiveness, based upon what we know about scripting in terms of what people respond. We work, we put our time and money into certain areas. In essence, we're placing bets. So, we want to place the best bet possible. We want to increase the probability that we're going to get the result that we seek. And if you have a rep that is not working that system, in essence, you're letting them bet with your money. And, we know how typically that ends up. So people want to bet. They have to bet within our rules. They spend their own money to waste.
I like that. If you had to 80-20 the effort in something here, where would you focus like a laser on the effort? Would it be on the list? Would it be on the script? Would it be on hiring a person with that type A personality? Where would you?
Nope. First of all, I wouldn't hire a type A personality. Okay. What I would hire is someone that could communicate well, who is willing to follow a system. In fact, I would stay away from a type A personality. I don't want that. I want someone who can communicate well, easy to listen to, will follow a system that's coachable. Type A's are going to go way off in too many directions, and that's not the kind of personality I would look like. But to your question, if I was going to focus on to be successful, first of all, profile the list, period. Get real serious, make no exceptions. Profile your list of buyers, jackhammer through the veins of gold. Only call A accounts and make sure you know the difference between an A prospect and a B, C, D, and E prospect. First of all, you got to do that. Second of all, you got to set yourself up, Ed. Companies, there's still a lot of companies that work very inefficiently. They make it harder for themselves. It's like, if you're going to go swimming, you wouldn't, tie a rock to your back and shackle, stones to your feet and so forth, because it's harder to move. A big part of prospecting success has to do with efficiency, working through a good quality group efficiently enough so that you increase the odds of bumping into higher probability buyers that are going to respond to your scripts. So if you don't have the right infrastructure so that a person can get on the phone and work through that group very efficiently, you are doomed before you begin. So list, infrastructure, working efficiently, and then have something valuable to say. When you do work so hard and get that, grade A buyer on the phone, say something that's valuable to them. What you offer, why you're credible, what the benefits are, and exactly what you want. Communicate value. So those would be the three things I would focus on.
That's awesome. This has been a really great call, Scott. I appreciate your time today. Is there anything you want to end with specifically? Anything that we should know? Anywhere where people could learn more about you? Anything like that?
Well, first of all, the website, Scott Channell, 2 T's, 2 N's, and 2 L's, .com. Tons of free information there, so jump on that. But there is one other point I want to make. We are we're talking, Ed, you and I, end of April here in the middle of the pandemic. And, before I make this point, I don't want to say that I think that this is in any way a good thing. I mean, I've got family members on the front line caring for COVID patients. I worry about them every day. It's serious stuff. But here's our reality. A lot of businesses are not going to survive. And if you study past recessions, I've been reading a lot about businesses that survive past recessions. Statistically, 17% don't survive. Heavy percentage of them 3 years after a recession have not reached pre-recession levels. So here's our reality. Our reality is that a lot of our competitors are going to disappear. Boom, okay? They're not going to survive. A lot of our competitors are going to be weakened, okay? And they're not going to be able to service their clients and the needs of clients. We're on the in the middle of or about to hit one of the greatest reallocations or dislocations, all right, of business going on, because there's going to be a lot of competitors that don't exist. for the people who are buying the services, they're going to have new needs, Ed. Their current service providers may go out of business, be much weaker, or not be able to meet their current needs. Mm-hmm. So this is the time to have big goals. There's never going to be, and again, I want to preface this, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but the reality is there's never going to be a time where you have an opportunity to pick up market share. If you're prepared for it and you go about it right, then today. Right. So the companies that I'm working with now, we're working much more on, hey, you know what, we are retooling our systems. We're cutting costs, but we want to do so smartly and not ruin our infrastructures or decrease our efficiencies. We want to plug our existing gaps, meet the needs of the current client. So what I'm saying is that for those who are going to appointment set, this is the time for you to understand that there's never going to be a greater opportunity probably if you're ready and if you're capable and if you work really smart, you can survive, maybe even thrive after this recession, because there's going to be less competition, there's going to be a lot of weaker competition, and clients are going to have different needs in this new world, whatever it's going to look like. And if you're attuned to that and you're set up, you can not only survive, but pick up market share in a way that you're not going to be able to do again, probably, hopefully, in our lifetime. So I would just leave you with that thought.
I 100% agree with everything you just said there. And I think it's actually going to be, if it's 17% for a standard recession, I think it's going to be worse than that here, because standard recessions have a slow decline in revenue over a period of time, whereas with this, it's just zero revenue, or 70, 80, 90% drop in revenue for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then it'll trail back up. It's going kind of the reverse. So there aren't many businesses that can survive that, and most people don't realize that, a normal business operates at like 5, 10, 15, 20% profit margin, net profit margin. You take a month away of revenue, you're looking at like 2 years worth of profitability for that business. So those numbers don't really add up. And you look at a stimulus package where you're paying for payroll, but what about everything else? What about all the cost of goods sold? What about, there's so much more that goes into it that they're just not accounting for. So I think it's going to be even worse than that, unfortunately. And you're right. I think there's going to be a really big opportunity to scoop up market share. And I agree, it's not a good thing, but we're in business to make money ethically, honestly. But there is going to be, opportunity. There's going to be blood in the street here in the next, from now for the next year, for big opportunities. I agree.
Yeah, and obviously I have a little bias here, but I do think that when people want to get to buyers faster, that directly calling that person is a good strategy. So again, I encourage you, use the strategy that's best for you. I'm not saying that calling is better than anything else in every circumstance, but I do think where time is short, and particularly if you have higher value targets and you know that more of them might be open to a different option, or you've got less competition, going directly at your A clients, or talk about 80-20, the 80-20 within the A, Ed, okay, the super uber value ones, to go directly at them is usually going to be a very profitable, high probability strategy, and this would be the time to do it.
Right. I agree. I like the Chet Holmes Dream 100 strategy, picking out your top 100 dream clients to work with and treating them as your A clients. For us, those are joint venture partners, strategic alliances, those types of people that we want to call into on a very frequent basis to get feet in the door there, so that it opens up more opportunities. That's how we treat the 80-20 of that Class A. So yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. This has been awesome, Scott. I love talking with you. I love reading your books. I love your content. Again, it's scottchannell.com, 2 T's, 2 N's, 2 L's. Scott's got 3 books on Amazon. I definitely recommend them. This got us kicked off in appointment setting and has been very profitable for us since. This has been great, Scott. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Ed. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a great day, Scott.